Oh, we're live.
Hello.
It's Mother Horror here. We are on the Nightworms YouTube channel. Nightworms is a monthly subscription horror service where you can get books delivered to your door. I co own that business with my partner Ashley. And this is our YouTube channel that we use to talk to authors and just see what they're up to and what resources and information we can get from them about their books and just about writing in general. So, here with me today is Gemma Amor. Um,
Hi.
Hi, Gemma. Gemma is one of my favorite authors of all time. I do not mind saying. The first book that I read of hers that everyone needs to go out and buy right now is there it is, Cruel Works of Nature. This is a short story collection with illustrations throughout that Gemma did herself. And then shortly thereafter, I needed some more, and I got Dear Laura, which is a novella, and Gemma was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award for this book because it's amazing. And if you haven't read it, you can add that to your cart right now. And then she came out with a second short story collection. This one is Till the Score is Paid. This also is illustrated throughout by Gemma. And the stories in here are just as compelling and just as wonderful as her first collection. So if you read the first one and you're wondering about the second one, yes, yes, get it. And then Gemma also has a collaborative novel that she did that is called Grief is a False God. Um, that one's illustrated. Um, Remind me who that was again, Gemma?
That's illustrated. I've got a copy here. This one is there we go. It's a novella, I guess, or a novelette, and the art's by Annabelle Santos, which he's an incredible artist. Yeah, and that's just a short, sharp, sweet one about a farm and a creepy presence that lives on a farm.
Yeah, that's I definitely need to buy that one. That one's on my to buy list. And then I also recently finished White Pines, which is a full length novel, cult horror and surprises and a rad female protagonist. Yeah, that book is a must have, must buy. I'm definitely nominating it for a Stoker, making sure everybody on the HWA gets that one in their hands. But yeah, we are going to be chatting today. Oh, Ashley is facilitating the live comments, so please feel free to chat it up in there, and she will let you know when it's time to start asking questions. We're probably going to do that in the last half hour or so. But in the meantime, we want to pick Gemma's brain about self publishing and indie publishing in general. She has a wealth of information for us. So go ahead, Gemma, and let us know, like, what's that field like?
Thank you. I also have to apologise, sorry, in advance for my camera's drunk and it keeps focusing in and out on me. So if it gets terrible, I might have to stop and start it again. But I'll wave at it and there we go. Yeah, so when Sadie and I were originally talking about this chat, we were thinking of, oh, come on, silly thing. Excuse me. There we go. We were originally just kind of shooting ideas backwards and forwards about what kind of thing we'd like to chat about live. And from my point of view, I think as a kind of purely self-published author now, and with a little bit of experience with indie publishing, one of the themes that has kind of been a recurring one for me throughout my kind of relatively short-lived career so far is the idea of creative freedom and what that means and how that's perhaps different in my experience than it would be from a more established author who's perhaps signed a contract with one of the bigger publishing houses or one of the big five. I should caveat that by saying I have absolutely zero experience with any of those large publishing houses. I'm in no way dismissing different channels or other ways of publishing, and my own dream and goal one day is to be signed and to have agent representation and all of that. So I'm not suggesting, I think, in any of this conversation that what one way of doing something is better than another. But I do think there are definite positives for somebody starting out in their career when it comes to kind of getting involved in the indie community and getting your own stuff out there, published by you, having control in that sense. So I'm not quite sure where to start. Like, where's a good place to start, do you think?
Well, I mean, just to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying about representation in the Big Five, I think as a reader, from a reader and a reviewing standpoint, when I first started reading books, of course, obviously it was whatever my mom had on her bookshelves, and going into the bookstore and just finding what was on the shelves. And obviously, it goes without saying that a lot of indie authors and small house publishing, they're not the first ones you see. It's basically like in the horror section, you're going to find a whole shelf of King and Kuntz and everything in between and on the sides, but they're all represented by big publishing houses like Penguin and Macmillan and all of those kinds of things. So when I first started on Bookstagram and started seeing all of the talent pool that was available to me from all these various different indie publishers and self-published authors, like I haven't read Stephen King's latest book. I mean, let's just say, like, I have it, but I'm preoccupied with what I have on my nightstand, which is all self and indie, So
I think I'm the same. I can't remember the last time I read a mainstream novel. I think I've mostly, although having said that, I can't really remember the last time I finished a novel anyway, because I just can't read at the moment. But yeah, my kind of consciousness is now filled with this world of writers that I know and love and actually feel a connection with. So I guess actually, like, that's a really good starting point. I don't think you can talk about self-publishing and indie publishing without talking about social media, without talking about Bookstagram, and without talking about it from a community point of view. So maybe that's a really good place to start, because it's essentially word of mouth marketing, which sells books, when you don't have a big marketing budget and you don't have access to high street stores and you don't, you don't have the big machine of one of the big five behind you. You're reliant, particularly when you start out and you have no money, on word of mouth. And there is no better word of mouth marketing than Bookstagram. And Twitter is more like a hangout for authors. I feel like Twitter is more of a place for authors perhaps than readers sometimes. Yeah. But Bookstagram is basically, apart from the fact that it's free advertising and it's brilliant if you do it properly, it's access to an enormous community of people who want to buy and read your books. And for the cost of like a decent smartphone, and some kind of artfully arranged shots and reaching out to the right people, you can, as I know, start to launch a writing career. So, like, maybe if I just backtrack a little bit and explain my journey so far, it might be helpful. Because the main thing for me is to talk about things that other people might find useful, I think, rather than just sort of talking about myself. But it's always good to share, I think, your own personal journey as a writer, for anyone out there who's interested or thinking about dipping their toes in. So I, for many years, worked in marketing, business marketing. I did study English literature at university many years ago. And I did drama as well. And I had a flair for the dramatic. And then I absolutely used none of that. I went and worked in corporate environments and engineering firms and telecoms companies for a good 10 years. And I was deeply miserable doing it. And it was very evident, I think, towards the end of that period that my heart really wasn't in it. That coincided with like a big, I guess, mental breakdown for me. I was very poorly. I'm very open about mental health struggles. I had a very well-documented decline, and I was made redundant from one job and then another job, probably rightly so, because I wasn't doing a very good job. And I suddenly found myself with an awful lot of time on my hands, and I've always wanted to take writing, which was a hobby until that point, to the next level and use it in a kind of therapeutic sense as well. So I just started writing, and for myself, not with an eye to ever being successful or famous or published or anything. I just started writing for me because I had things I wanted to get down on paper. I had feelings and emotions I wanted to express. I had ideas I wanted to explore. And all I cared about was the act of writing, rather than all the stuff that came after that. Which I think is also quite important, because I think sometimes as a writer, you get so hung up on whether or not something's going to sell, how marketable it is, whether people are going to like it, what you're going to do with it, that you forget to just enjoy the process and just write stories, you know. And then I submitted a story to a podcast, a well-known podcast called the No Sleep Podcast, and it was accepted. And I think that first acceptance and hearing my work produced and seeing it published in that form gave me the confidence to just then keep doing it. And then I think before I knew what I was doing, I was talking to an indie publisher who I met through the No Sleep Podcast, and I had a collection of short stories, which Sadie pointed out earlier, which was Cruel Works. And before I knew it, there was a book, and it went on sale, and people started buying it, and it was really shocking that people started buying it. And I'm not talking big numbers. I think I sold maybe 15 copies in the first 3 months or something silly like that. But for me, that was 15 copies of my book that somebody actually wanted to buy. And I was lucky because I had access to the podcast as well. I managed to, the show host, David Cummings, has always been a huge supporter of me, gave me a load of shout outs on the show, and listeners started to come to me that way. And then the word of mouth began to gather. And I think that's at that point I discovered Bookstagram and a lady called Sadie Hartmann, who I approached I told this story before, but I approached very nervously and in an uber polite British way.
Which was the cutest thing ever.
I think I'd seen a rant, or not a rant, like a strongly worded tweet that you'd put on Twitter about somebody that approached you rudely, and how much it annoyed you. And I was so conscious of that I wrote this like really long, florid, like, excuse me, and I said sorry about a million times, and please take my book, please. And it paid off because I was obviously so polite.
Just to throw it out there for anyone who's writing and just wants to approach reviewers, like, I feel like Twitter is just a scary place because you see, you know, a lot of reviewers complaining about bad author behavior, but I mean, it's really few and far between. Like, I've had, you know, I can count on one hand, like, how many authors, you know, have been like super misbehaved. But yeah, just reach out, you know, is the first step.
Yeah, I think reaching out and being confident and reaching out, finding people who love reading what you write and who are passionate about writers and they're passionate about your genre is the first step. Once you've figured that out, then just being as polite as you possibly can and following the guidelines. And if there are submission guidelines, they're there for a reason. And that's because book reviewers in general get so many requests that they have to organize their information flow as it comes in. So you must, you know, following the guidelines is a must. But I think this is a general rule for writers or anything in life, really, is just being as polite as you can goes a long way. Like, you know, you're a writer, you're not God. There's no ego involved here. You've just put a load of words together into a book. So just shove that ego over on the shelf and be polite. That's all I can say in that, you know.
And I mean, we're just humans, you know. So on the other hand, like, reviewers aren't God either. So if somebody, you know, fumbles or gets your name wrong a little bit, or, you know, doesn't approach you in exactly the right platform, like doesn't have your email, so does slide up in your DMs, you know, it's like, just give people a little bit of grace. Like, they're just human. So
yeah, not like the people that slide into my DMs and ask for pictures of my feet, which is completely different.
Not those kind of things, please.
You'd be surprised how many. I don't post pictures of my pedicure anymore. It's a bit sad.
Yeah.
I've totally thrown myself off track. Anyway, so I think, like, for me as a writer, like my journey, I think, really began not with publishing that first book, not with publishing that first story, not even with the act of sort of sitting down and figuring out that I could write every day and I still do. You know, I write from 9 until 1 every day, solid. The journey began for me, I think, when people started reviewing the book and posting about it on social media, and that word of mouth momentum started up. So Sadie very kindly accepted the book, and then the Nightworms crew each got a copy, and so before long I started to see my book popping up in kind of very beautiful, very well put together photographs on Instagram, which in itself is an enormous confidence boost. And I don't think you can underestimate how much having a little confidence boost is really important as a writer as well, particularly when you're starting out. Seeing a lovely photo of your book with nice things written under it is, again, I talked about ego earlier on. Let's bring the ego back a little bit, and that helps you. It gives you momentum and it drives you on, because I don't write for my readers. I write for me on a personal level because I have things I want to say. But at the same time, it's really lovely to know that your work resonates with other people out there, and that they appreciate what you're trying to do and they get the message behind what you were trying to say. So yeah, I can't it's interesting in that I've spoken to authors who are with bigger publishing houses, with the big 5, and they're still doing the same thing you're doing as an indie author or a self-published author. They're all out there they're very well aware of the benefits of Bookstagram. They're all out there on Twitter interacting and promoting themselves constantly all the time. Even if you have that big marketing budget behind you, we're all doing the same thing because we've all figured out that there's merit to doing that as a writer. And building a brand, which I think is a horrible phrase I've picked up from my marketing days, but it really does pay.
Yeah, it is a thing.
Yeah, and so Sadie has a brand and the Nightworms have a brand, and it's very indie centric, and it's quite sort of irreverent sometimes, but also very slick and professional, and the graphics are all kind of together, and everything's very beautifully presented, and it's enormously accessible for readers who are scrolling through Instagram just going, I don't know what to read. Oh, this looks nice. Right. And as a writer, you have to kind of try and emulate that as much as possible, I think, if you want to be serious about being self-published. And that's what I found. I found that the more seriously I took social media, the more success I had. So
yeah, that sounds really important. I think Bookstagram is maybe like 4 to 5 years in the making, and just kind of like gaining in momentum. And now it is like a serious platform. I've seen like when you get an advanced reading copy and it's got like on the inside cover like all of the marketing that they're doing for that particular novel, and Bookstagram and influencers are like top on the list, like to them. So Ashley, it looks like Ashley is accumulating some questions, so we're gonna go ahead and answer some of those.
Okay, so in Indian self-publishing, who has final say over title and cover design? I think we need to separate out indie and self-publishing. So for me, when I talk about indie publishing, I talk about small publishing houses who are probably, I don't know, less than 100 people, or that might not be the right way of approaching it. Perhaps it's more of a case of readership or budgets, but they are still a publishing house. So they will still take your manuscript, or they should. They will still edit it for you. They will still provide cover design services. And put the book together, and they may or may not then publish it for you on Amazon, or they may have access to their own printing house. So that's my understanding of an indie publisher. They're quite genre specific. Particularly, there's a lot of really decent indie publishers in the horror space. And I again, my experience so far is also limited to the horror genre. So I'm in no way, shape, or form an authority on indie publishing in general. But my experience of who does all of that with indie publishing is, as a writer, I've always had the last say on a book title. I think if I was to come up with something totally ludicrous that had the word tits in it, that maybe an indie publisher might give me some feedback. Who knows? It might not, maybe not. It depends on the company, I think, and how good your relationship is with that. When it comes to cover design, indie publishers in general, they have people on their books that they are used to working with, or artists who they've got a relationship with. What I think should happen generally is that you are allowed to give feedback on covers when they're in development. That doesn't always happen. in my case, so with Cruel Works and with Till the Score is Paid, which are both my short story collections, there's a running kind of look and style that I was going for. I like the idea of presenting a series of short story collections that look like they belong to the same family of books.
Readers like that too, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And they like familiarity. And so if you look at when the Big Five do reprints of King's books, that there's the same cover author is used throughout. And because it creates this beautiful sequence of books, I wish my camera would stop dicking around. So I actually had an artist in mind through the No Sleep podcast, is a chap called Mark Pelham, who's a brilliant artist. And I approached, these were both published by indie publishers. This one was published by Haunted House, and this one was published by a company called Jars Press. These are now, neither of these are with either of those publishers. They now reside with me. But actually at the time they were very accommodating of me suggesting my own cover artist, and I think Mark has done a lovely job. It's important, actually, this one isn't available for purchase at the moment because I am reformatting it and re-releasing it with a brand new cover and 2 new stories and 2 illustrations very shortly. I'm just waiting for the cover art to come in. If you're self-published, I think it goes without saying that you do all of that yourself. You have the final say on all of that. And this is the joy that I found of self-publishing, is you don't need to ask anyone's permission. You just get on and do it yourself. You make your own decisions. You reach out to your own artists. You have to take on all the other duties and responsibilities like editing, formatting and all that jazz. But you can be unilateral in your own decision-making, which is lovely. And this is what we mean, I think, by creative freedom, which we can probably talk about in a bit more depth in a bit. Yeah. Sorry, my sync camera.
What suggestions would Gemma have for pulling in the high number of reviews she's amassed on Goodreads and Amazon Instagram?
So reviews are a numbers game. Amazon is a numbers game. Goodreads is a numbers game. And it, in terms of Amazon, the algorithms, I think, are much more likely to pick up your book and display it more frequently the more reviews you have. So they kind of are, I believe, anyway, they are lifeblood to authors. And it also goes without saying that the more recommendations and reviews a book has, the better it looks subconsciously to someone thinking about buying your book. I might throw this camera in the garden in a minute. I might use my phone. It's drunk. I would say my recommendations are kind of threefold. Get yourself out there and push your book out to book reviewers. And so people like Nightworms, people like Sadie, bookstagrammers, book reviewers, all tend to post their reviews on their own websites, which is lovely because you can share that content, and to Amazon and to Goodreads. So that's a really good place to start. So start working on your emails and your manners, and getting digital or physical copies prepped to send to as many reviewers as you can afford, or, you know, because a lot of reviewers also only like physical copies, but they may take digital copies if you can't do that. Approach as many reviewers as you can, first and foremost. Ask people to review your book, but by this I mean ask them to genuinely review your book. I don't mean emailing Auntie Flo and asking her to like spam Amazon with 10,000 reviews of how amazing you are as a writer and how you're the next H.P. Lovecraft, because nobody wants to be him at the moment anyway.
Yeah, right.
It's you know, spam is not good. People pick up on spam, and it's blatantly obvious when someone spammed their own book with decent reviews. But you are allowed to ask people to review your book. So if you sent somebody a copy of your book, then you're allowed to follow up with an email and say, would you mind, if you've read my book, posting a review, an honest review, to Goodreads and Amazon? If you're active on Twitter like I am, you know, just get into the habit every now and then of sharing a link to your Amazon page where your book is featured, or Goodreads page, and just asking people that may have read the book, if they haven't had a chance yet, to drop a review. And people often need reminding and they need nudging. And the thing about social media as well, I was talking to a friend about this the other day, is when you tweet and when you post, specific, clear instructions to your readers go an awful long way. So rather than just dropping a link to your Amazon page and then just sort of writing something self-effacing like, oh, I wrote this book, it's probably a bit shit, but you should probably read it, which a lot of us do because we don't like coming across as like arrogant.
Yeah.
You could rephrase that in a non-arrogant way by specifically asking people to support you by posting a review, or specifically asking people to retweet. Don't take for granted that everybody wants to interact with you. They're just scrolling lazily a lot of the time. Give them instructions, and subconsciously those instructions will go in and people will be much more likely to act upon them.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for those reminders as well, because for someone like myself, like writing for a Scream magazine platform, sometimes those reviews that I write are 3, 4, 5 months old, and I have to give them a lead time. So those reviews I have forgotten. You know, if I wrote them in January, by June, I have forgotten, and I need that reminder. Like, please drop a cross post, and then it reminds me that I'm over my deadline for cross posting. So I appreciate the reminders.
I think it's a give and take thing, isn't it? If you want people to interact with you and to support your stuff, you kind of have to tell them how as well. We human beings like being told what to do, unfortunately, which is why we're also like suggestive to advertising, things like that.
There's just a bunch of hellos. Hello,
yeah, I was looking at those questions.
Redbeard. Hello, all of you friends.
Oh yeah, so Scott's question came up on Facebook. Scott Kruckenberg wants to know how much of your creative vision do you lose using a publishing company versus self-publishing? I think, I don't know whether you were talking about indie or one of the big five. I can't talk about any of the bigger publishing houses, so I'm only going to focus on the indie point of view. And thus far, I have lost none of my creative vision publishing either route. Sorry, I'm British. Because the writing process, I think, tends to involve more people the higher up the scale you go. So the more the bigger publishing house you work with, they are much more likely to have developmental editors on board, to have people who can feed back on your manuscripts and guide you through that storytelling process, give you ideas for rewrites and things like that. That's, I think, how it tends to work with the bigger houses. With the smaller houses, they don't necessarily have the resources for that. So you're pretty much on your own in that sense. And actually, in a way, it gives you an awful lot of freedom to just write whatever the hell it is you want to write, and to not get bogged down with worrying about whether it fits into a certain genre, whether it's marketable in that sense. So a lot of the books I write, have written thus far, all 5 of them, it's been very difficult for me to tell you exactly what genre. So White Pines, for example, had so many elements from so many different horror genres all kind of mashed into one book that I think it would have been a very difficult sell if I'd taken it to an agent, and a very difficult thing to have tried to sell to a bigger publishing house. But having said that, I knew I needed help with that story. That book was an absolute bitch to write, and it taught me an awful lot, but it was like pulling teeth. And I actually approached a developmental editor myself, a really lovely chap called Dan Hanks, who has got his own book coming out this year, called Captain Moxley and the something, and he's going to hate me for this, and I will come back to that. And The Embers of the Empire, which is like a Indiana Jones meets kind of fantasy thing. But so he really helped me to write a better book, and he helped me to shape that creative vision into something that was a little bit easier for the reader to digest. So the book as it exists now is very, very different to the version that I sent Dan 8-9 months ago, which was a bit of a mess. But in terms of like, if you're working with a good indie publisher who can see what you're trying to achieve, or whether you're doing it yourself, I don't think your creative vision suffers in either of those scenarios.
Thank you, Israel. Good to see you. Here's a question. Matt is a Nightworms reviewer, so I'll go ahead and read. Hi, Gemma. You've talked about confidence. How do you deal with imposter syndrome and feeling like your work isn't good enough? I bet that's a good one.
It's a really good one. So anyone that knows me on one of the social media persona, we were talking about brand earlier on, and my brand is I guess unfailingly honest, even when I'm having meltdowns, which I frequently do live on Twitter. It's great fun if you're after that kind of content. It's very entertaining. My existential crises are enormously entertaining for everybody else.
We always know that Gemma's going to talk about her kid raising hell or her confidence levels plummeting.
Pretty much. I am a bit of a broken record in that sense, because it's a daily struggle to put that concept of ego. And this was something I was chatting to another author about, another podcast, a very kind of well-known author called Jeff Noon, and he was talking about ego and how you have to kind of remove it from yourself to be a better writer. And I think part and parcel of that is this idea of imposter syndrome, that what you're doing isn't good enough, that what you're doing is fraudulent somehow, that people will see through the fact that you've only been, like for me, I've only been doing this for like less than 2 years now. And I'm making it up as I go along. Every single day, I'm winging the shit out of this. And so far, I've kind of just thrown stuff at the wall, and I've been lucky in that it's stuck. Not everything sticks.
She has a Bram Stoker nomination.
Again, I really did wing that, and I did, like, I never set out to write that book with an aim to getting that nominated or for submitting it anywhere. I just kind of wrote that book because that was the story that I felt I needed to tell at that time in my life. So when it comes to confidence and imposter syndrome, I think there are a couple of things you can do when you're starting out as a writer, and I have to remind myself to do this. So don't do as I do as I say. Because I struggle. I think the most valuable thing you can do for yourself is stop comparing yourself to anybody else. Stop comparing yourself to other writers. Who gives a shit if somebody else has got an award nomination or has signed a big contract or has got agent representation or has their books in the high street stores with, big marketing budgets, but who gives a fuck? Like, just stop focusing on everybody around you and all of that noise, which can be very difficult, particularly if you're really immersed in that whole social media culture, which I am. And it's really hard to not get down about your own lack of progress when you see other people's stars on the rise. But this isn't a competition. Like, we are not in this to win or succeed over anybody else. And if you are, you're probably not really going to.
Right. People are gonna see that.
Yeah, people see through that shit. They don't like it at all. And it does wonders for your own confidence if you stop comparing yourself to other people. So that's the first thing I would say. Secondly, if you're like me and you're having a wobble and it's not going well and you're in a writing funk and the words don't come out and you want to cry, stop and go and do something else. Like, and you may be on a deadline, but that deadline will wait a day. And if it hasn't, then you've gone too close to the wire. Then whatever you're writing and trying desperately to push out last minute, it's probably not going to be that good anyway. You should give yourself a lot of time as a writer before a deadline is up, she says, laughing. Give yourself a break. Go and watch a movie. Go and listen to a podcast. Go for a walk. Do some exercise. Go and have a drink. Not too much. I don't advocate drinking too much. Talk to a friend. Like, go and smoke a cigarette or just break that cycle in any way you can, because the longer you sit there fretting and worrying that you're not good enough, you're not going to write something. You're going to write something stodgy that doesn't hang together very well, and just give yourself a rest. It's okay to take a rest as a writer. And I know a lot of us don't. I know a lot of us drive ourselves constantly because we want to succeed. We want to be the next, I was going to say J.K. Rowling, but let's not do that. Ain't nobody want to be her at the moment.
No.
But you want that success, and it sometimes wanting it interferes with the writing process, I think, as I've said earlier on as well. So giving yourself a break is really important. And then finally, one of the things I found really useful with imposter syndrome, particularly when I'm in the middle of writing a book and I'm having a wobble, is find yourself a lovely I would say, trusted beta reader or developmental editor like Dan. And I have a couple of beta readers, so I'm going to shout out Ross and Aidan at this juncture, Aidan Merchant. They have both been wonderful for me. If I'm in the middle of writing a book and I'm having an absolute mare with it, I have sent them unfinished drafts of my manuscript. And what it's done is it's pulled me out of a funk, because they've gone away and they've read it and they've fed back, and the feedback has been useful. And this is before the book's even finished. It's at that midway point. So, you know, when you hit that like 40, 50,000 word mark and everything just goes to shit because there's that bit in the middle, which is more difficult than giving birth in real life. It's just the worst part of writing a book. And the end is fine. The beginning 50K words are fine. But that bit there, that sticking point, that's when I quite often bring in a beta reader or somebody I trust to read the book, reassure me that it isn't gash, isn't shit. And that just gives me momentum and keeps me going. And then I actually end up finishing the book because I know I've got something worth working on. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I thought that was great. Callie, another Nightworms reviewer, she says, I'd love to hear a bit about timing in your marketing. I have seen some people market their books really early and some that market a little late. Do you have a method for timing in your marketing?
I would say that I probably should spend more time marketing earlier than I do. I'm a bit slapdash and I get very impatient. So I tend to write a book and bash it out and get it out as quickly as I can. I don't really do pre-orders, which I'm pretty sure I should be doing. I'm not very good at building hype. I like to kind of stealth drop a book and then promote the fuck out of it once it's published and once it's live. Sorry, I'm swearing so much. I'm sorry.
We don't have a rating here at Nightworms.
Okay, good. I don't have a mouth filter at all. I think if I was to talk to other authors who've been at this game a bit longer than me, they would probably recommend that you spend considerable amount of time earlier on in the process marketing your book and doing the hype and doing the lead up. And what that tends to do is, if you've got a cover design all ready to go, which is good, that you can keep promoting from sometimes up to 6 months before a book is released, it gets into people's subconscious. And again, so I did this. So for White Pines, this book cover here, keep doing that. This book cover here, which is by the enormously talented Keelan Patrick Burke, who I'm sure you all know and love. I had that worked up before I finished the manuscript because I knew I wanted to just keep dropping it and teasing people with it. I think that's the first book where I did that. All the other books, particularly with Dear Laura, I wrote in 2.5 weeks and I dropped it as soon as I'd finished it. And it had like loads of typos and all sorts of things in. So I think a lead up is better. There's a lot of talk about how pre-orders are also really, really good for rankings in Amazon. That's something I need to explore in much more detail. I am not, I'm doing this all on my own and I'm learning as I go through, and I need to slow down a bit and focus more on the business mechanics of it. But I'm so intently focused on the writing and then the promoting once it's out, that I think there are definite areas where I need to just sit down and have a think and come up with a better strategy. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
yeah, I can jump in too, just on the other end of it. The Nightworms review team and also our blog serves as sort of that pre-launch avenue for writers, especially indie writers. So we can do cover reveals on our blog and get some early traction on that. And then we have 20 people on our team who all review and post on Bookstagram and Twitter, these like staged photos for Bookstagram of the book, and get some early buzz and traction on that. And then we read it and review it, and it kind of seasons the pot on Goodreads and Amazon to get those early reviews. So that's a service. I mean, we don't have time to take every book in the world, but it doesn't hurt to ask about the cover reveal for sure. We will do those all day long. So we have plenty of time for that.
The thing about cover reveals as well is it gives, like, from a psychological perspective as a writer, it gives your book an identity and a personality. And it's like a mission statement for your book, really. Your cover is in essence what your book is about, or should be. And it's like your shop front. And for me, having that identity to come back to keeps me going as a writer as well. And it's a focal point, which I think is actually really important. So I tend to say, although the marketing side of things I'm not so good at earlier on, I do always try and get a book cover as early on as I can, so that I've got something to just keep looking at and keep teasing myself with almost as well. And it's just a lovely visual cue to keep me going.
Yeah, and readers cover by all the time. So, oh, here's a question from Siri. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just reading aloud. How difficult was it to move on from a publisher emotionally or legally? It wasn't very difficult in either sense, actually, for either of the publishers that I have been with. And we probably shouldn't touch on that too much. But it's a good idea if you are signing with an indie publisher to look at your contract, and rather than getting excited because you've been offered a contract and signing it without reading it properly, please, I mean, this goes for anything, but please do look at your book contract. So look at things like what happens to the rights if the publisher goes out of business. How long does it take for the rights to revert back to you? What happens when when a book goes out of print? There's every single publishing house will have their own version of a publishing contract. There doesn't seem to be one size fits all, and it's very worth your time, particularly in that indie space, because it's quite a volatile marketplace and indie publishers go in and out of business constantly, or they get toppled because you find out that their staff aren't, we've all seen the horror stories of several publishing houses over the last 6 months just collapsing, not paying their authors, being racist, being sexually abusive. All of that jazz can topple a publishing house, rightly so, in a matter of weeks. And as an author, if that happens to you, it's not great. So you need to look at your publishing contract. The ones that I've worked with, if the company has gone out of business, the rights have automatically reverted back to me. So it's actually been really straightforward in that sense, legally. But I think this is one of the big areas where you as a writer feel the most anxiety, is when you're signing away not your copyright, when you're signing away something that belongs to you so that another company can own the publishing rights to that. It's worth your while doing your due diligence and asking other writers who may have been with that publishing company or currently signed with them. Twitter's a really good place for that if you put out a shout on Twitter. So I was lucky enough that I was approached by a German publishing company for the German language rights to Dear Laura. I put out a shout on Twitter, just asked if anyone knows anything about foreign language publishing rights, because I knew nothing. And I was very, very lucky that an incredibly helpful person looked through the contract and fed back to me. So, use the network that you've built on Twitter as well to help you with that process. But emotionally, it wasn't a struggle. Oh, this is Johan, I think. Hi, Gemma. What was the main inspiration for Caleb? How did that story grow? What kind of research did you do for it? So Caleb is a story in Till the Score is Paid, which, like I said, is coming out again soon, and will be in there. It's about, it's set in World War II, and it's about a woman who has been sort of left behind in the war by her fiancé to run a farm with her fiancé's brother, and things increasingly creepy start to happen. But she takes in an evacuee child that's sent to her from the city. And in those days, the government started paying families to take in evacuee children to get them out of cities that were being heavily bombed by kind of Nazi Luftwaffe and stuff like that. So inspiration came from the idea of exploring isolation, which turned out to be really prescient given everything that we've been through in the last 6 months with COVID. It grew as a result of me just, the more I read about the war and the more I read about the experiences of evacuees who were sent away from their families to live in the countryside, the more I read about the families that took those children in, and the sheer kind of loneliness of so many women who were left behind by their men as well. The men went off to fight, and no doubt they had a much worse time on the front lines and stuff. But there were, a whole generation of women who were left behind to kind of man the fort, and who were being bombed, and who had to make ends meet with no money, and to look after evacuee children or look after their own children. And it was just a really fascinating period in history. So that's, I did a lot of research, and I read a lot of letters. Oh, for heaven's sakes. I don't know what's wrong with it. I read a lot of letters. The BBC did a project talking to people who took in evacuees, and they published a whole chunk of letters on their website, written by evacuees, written by women who took in evacuees. And it was really fascinating, and it was really inspirational in that sense. So my camera's going nuts at the moment.
We're going to do a little rapid fire session so that we can round out our hour here. So get your questions in. We're going to answer these lickety splits. Hi, Gemma. What's your best advice for someone looking to get into indie publishing, not self-publishing, who has never been published before? Thank you.
My advice would be to look at the books that you like reading, first and foremost. If there's a certain kind of subgenre or facet to horror that you particularly are in love with, that you love to write about, try and find a publishing house who tend to publish authors that are like the writer that you want to be or that you are. Because the chances are that when you then go on to submit to those publishing houses, they're much more likely to accept you, because it's their kind of in their ballpark. I would say treat it as professionally as you possibly can, just like anything. Be very mindful of submission guidelines and windows and how you talk to people. Endlessly format and reformat and spell check and all that stuff, and just go for it. Just don't hold back. Don't be afraid to submit.
Yeah, and also there's quite a few different publishing houses that will put their open calls out for submissions, for unagented submissions. So Twitter's a good resource for that.
Yeah, actually the idea of unagented stuff as well. So there are still some, I guess, indie or not quite indie, but sort of higher level indie companies that will only accept submissions from people with an agent or through a direct portal, where the submission window time is kind of limited. Keep a list and get yourself really familiar with what the submission protocol is.
Yes. Okay, would you rather submit your manuscript, this is from Adrian, for any type of book to an indie publisher, or would you self-publish your manuscript yourself? What are some important differences between those two methods?
I think we've covered this off a little bit in the chat before, but I would say that I do have a healthy relationship with Cemetery Gates Media, who are very proactive, very good quality indie publisher who've got a real focus on kind of evocative horror and storytelling. So that suits me, and they're very open to me approaching them with my own ideas. So there are certain stories and ideas that I would pitch to them, and I have indeed pitched to them, or they've pitched to me, in fact, because we have a really nice two-way relationship. And then there are other things. So White Pines, again, is a really good example of something that I knew I had to self-publish, because I knew it would be nigh on impossible to try and explain it to somebody else on a submission basis. And I also wanted to get it out quickly. I mean, we're talking speed here. I like to get a book written and out within a year if I can, if not 6 months. And so for me, self-publishing allows me to do that. I'm going to murder my camera. Much more quickly than if I submit it and then have to wait for edits and cover designers and all the rest of it that you do when you're in the machine. My camera's giving me travel sickness. There we go.
Okay, Ashley, we're ready for the next one. Hold on one sec. I'll grab one.
Okay.
Oh, wait, here it comes. What is your favorite book that you have written? This is from Marcy, who is also a Nightworms review team reviewer. I imagine you love them all, but which one would you recommend to someone who is a first-time reader of your work?
I think it depends on what kind of mood you're in. my books are quite different. So my short story collections are all quite different themes. And so if you're in the mood for kind of something easy to read, perhaps I would start with Cruel Works of Nature. That's a short story collection, and the stories are themed around the idea of nature kind of being a bit perverted and going a little bit wrong. And there's some really fun stories in there that are kind of ones you can work through quite quickly, I think. Yeah, that one. And there's a couple of my favorite stories in there as well. There's one called Foliage, which is about an overgrown, haunted, like sort of empty house mansion thing, and some creepy vines and things like that. I think if you want something more psychological, you could probably read Dear Laura. It's a 28,000 word novella, and it's about an abusive relationship a woman has with a stalker. And then if you want something completely kind of fantastical and bonkers and not really in any particular genre, you could go for White Pines, because that sort of that's about cults and caves and islands and people going missing and just
so good.
So many things going on there. And then if you want to read something a bit more revenge retribution based, then when this comes back out again, there are some, I think, some of my more heartfelt stories. There's a story in that called Justine, which is about a survivor of abuse again, and her journey. That was actually my modern take on the myth of Euripides and Orpheus, and he goes to the underworld to recover Eurydice. And it's about coming to terms with trauma. So there's some more hard-hitting stories in that one. That's much more about kind of the harm that we do to each other. That's a short story collection too.
Christopher Buellman wants to know, hi Christopher.
Hey, Chris.
Hire a professional editor before you publish. What's the most helpful observation an editor or a beta reader has ever made?
Yeah, so not for line edits. Line edits I do myself, where you go through line by line and correct your own shitty typos, which is probably why there's quite a lot of typos in my books. But from a developmental point of view, I've used, and I would definitely use Dan Hanks again. And what was incredibly helpful about his observations were, so things like pacing. If a story is kind of grinding a bit to a halt, he helped me to identify stodgier areas where perhaps something needed to happen. He helped me to identify when I was relying way too much on observation and description, as opposed to, or trying to present an entire plot point, like a really serious plot point, purely through conversation, which also was quite difficult as a reader to digest. So he made so many helpful observations that I didn't even know where to start. But he just helped me to take a very rough manuscript and turn it into something much, much more compelling, because it's a second set of eyes, and you're so close to your book once you've written it and reread the same paragraph 10,000 times. I would say that I use developmental editors, and I hope to always do that going forward. And beta readers are often able to pick up on things. So, for example, one of the things that always comes out with me is when a character is being particularly unlikable. And I don't necessarily think you need to make every character likable, but what you want is for people to at least feel something about that character, even if they get killed, or whether they're the survivor or the protagonist or the antagonist, they need to feel something. And beta readers are really good at feeding back on whether or not that character does what you need it to do as well.
David Kilgore says, how do you decide what stories to submit to podcasts, and which to save for books? That'll be our question.
Everything I write short story wise, I submit somewhere. There's nothing that I don't submit somewhere. Like, if you've got that there, it's like capital. You may as well submit it and see what happens. And then I pretty much publish everything I write as well. There's not much point writing a story for me and not doing something with it. So the things that I've got out for submission, I don't tend to submit to a lot of places outside of podcasts. I don't tend to submit to magazines or anthologies or that much. I don't really have time, for one thing, and I can't keep track of things very easily. So there is not anything that I've written that I don't intend to publish at some point or do something with, because that's what I do. That's my business, and words are kind of my my bread and butter.
So that is going to conclude our chat. I would definitely love to have you on again to talk about more topics in the future.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you can find Gemma online. I have posted various different links in the description. I'll pop up some more. But all of her books are available except Till the Score is Paid. Is that correct, Gemma?
Yeah, and hopefully that should be re-available with a different title and a different cover.
Yeah,
it's going to be called These Wounds We Make, and that's coming out soon.
Ooh, that's exciting. Well, we can do the cover reveal for you too. So you can follow her on Twitter. You can follow her on Instagram. She takes lots of really cute selfies and some landscapes of her area. So go ahead and continue to leave comments and hang out in the chats if you want, or ask your questions on Twitter. Both Gemma and I hang out there pretty frequently, so we have time for that. And then this video is also going to stay on our channel. If you missed a part of it or you want to go back and watch it, it's here for you. But yeah, we just want to thank you so much, Gemma, for coming on the show. And
thank you for having me.
Yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your evening. And thank you everyone for showing up.
Thank you.